Okay, we've talked a lot about Democrats and Republicans this year. This is just going to be a quick crash course on third parties, like what third parties are, why they're not more influential, and like how they have actually been influential as well. Okay, so a third party is what we call any organized political party that isn't the Democrats or the Republicans. So the Green Party, the Reform Party, any other party that's out there that's just not the Democrats or the Republicans is what we call a third party. Okay, so what are the obstacles to third parties having more success than they do in the American system? A lot of people look at third parties as like they're a waste of time. They can't get elected. Like, why is that the case? If people are so dissatisfied with Democrats and Republicans today, why aren't third parties more successful? Okay, number one is the fact that our election system is all basically centered around the idea of winner take all, right? Where we basically only allow the candidate that gets the most votes to actually win, right? So if you and then hold the office. So with our congressional districts, right? Whoever gets the most votes in each district wins, right? For our presidential election system, whoever gets the most electoral votes in a state gets all of the points. It's all about whoever wins takes everything, gets everything. Whereas, and that generally leads to just Democrats or Republicans winning everything. Whereas in other countries, right, it's like the percentage of the vote that the party gets is the percentage of the seats that they fill. So look at like Sweden. Look at all the different political parties they have represented, because they basically fill up their parliament, right, based on proportional voting. Whatever percentage the party gets nationally is what percentage of seats they get. So it allows more success for smaller parties. You have to win everything to win the election in our system. So winner take all definitely hurts third parties. Third parties definitely have a difficult time fundraising, right? One of the advantages that incumbents have that come from the major parties is that ultimately they have a lot of media attention, right? Media stations just don't really cover like third party candidates all that much, right? So that gives a huge fundraising advantage because people just notice the name and perceive the major candidates to be more influential, right? If you just look at how much money was spent, right, for the 2020 election, look at how much money Biden spent. Look at how much money Trump spent. And then look at how much money the number one third party candidate, Joe Jorgensen, who was the libertarian, spent. I mean, it's not even comparable, right? And that just puts third parties at such a disadvantage. Also, election rules are written by Democrats and Republicans. It's not in the interest of the major political parties to make third parties more competitive. So almost all the rules are written to benefit the two major parties, right? Because it's those party members that are writing the rules. So if you just look at like Pennsylvania's like voter registration, right? To vote in the primary, you must register either with the Democrat or Republican parties, right? So just that, right, alone is like if you're not a Democrat or Republican, you're not really participating in the primary process, right? That's a rule established by Democrats and Republicans, right? Or if you look at kind of, fundraising and how that works, there is something called the Presidential Election Campaign Fund that when your parents fill out their income tax, they can actually donate money to a presidential election campaign fund, right? We talked about one of the disadvantages third parties have is that they just can't like fundraise. But the rule is that if you take this public money, which any candidate that would have taken this, right, in the 2020 election would have been given $108 million, you are not permitted to spend any of your own money. So if you take the money, right, from the presidential election campaign fund that's accumulated from people's like tax returns, you're not eligible to basically spend your own money, almost like a salary cap. The big party candidates don't take this public money. It just sits there unused because, as you just saw on the last slide, they spend a lot more than 108 million. But a third party candidate like Joe Jorgensen would be desperate to get $108 million. Somebody that only spent about $3 million in their total campaign, but they can't get access to it because the rules are written by Democrats and Republicans. You have to earn 5% of the popular vote in the previous presidential election to qualify to dip into that federal election campaign fund. Third-party candidates can't get that. So the big parties are eligible, but they don't take it because they can spend more than 108 million. And the third parties aren't qualifying because the threshold is set just high enough that they don't qualify for it. All right. So what impact do third parties have if they're not generally winning elections? Well, number one of the major things that third parties do is they bring attention to issues that are ignored by the two big parties. So, for example, the guy pictured here is Eugene Debs. He ran for president 5 times in the early 1900s. Never won, right? Basically was for the Socialist Party, right? But ideas that he cared about, like the Federal Reserve System, like the banking system for this country, that was his idea, right? The progressive income tax, the idea that wealthier people should pay more money, that was his idea. Now, he never got elected to be able to bring these ideas into being, but the best thing that can often happen to third parties is that the big parties notice that they get some attention for the issue that they talk about, and that the big party swoops in and then they steal it for themselves. So the candidate fades away, or the party may fade away, but the issue lives on when one of the big parties grabs it for their own, right? Like women's rights, child labor, the abolition movement. All of these things came from smaller parties that were eventually adopted by the larger parties. And then secondly, though third-party candidates don't really have the ability to win elections because of the reasons we talked about, they can sometimes play the role of spoiler. So maybe if a third-party candidate is actually fairly popular, it's not going to be enough to get them elected, but they may take support away from another candidate. So if you look at 1912, Woodrow Wilson is the Democrat running for president. Taft is the Republican that's running for re-election. Teddy Roosevelt had previously been president and then had basically left. He was Republican. Taft basically took over for him. Well, Roosevelt wasn't super happy with the job that Taft was doing, so he decided to come back 4 years later and run as part of a third party called the Progressive Party. But it's kind of like having two Republicans run against a Democrat. So the Republicans are all kind of splitting their vote between Roosevelt and Taft, and that makes it easier for Wilson to win, right? Or if you look at the 1992 election. In this particular election, Bill Clinton was a young governor from Arkansas, Democrat, challenging the incumbent president, George H.W. Bush, who was the Republican. There was a pretty legitimate third-party candidate, a guy named Ross Perot, who was running as part of the Independent Party. But he received, as you can see, almost 19% of the total vote. There were 19 million Americans that voted for him. Look at how close it was between Clinton and Bush. The presence of Perot in this election may have made a difference. Some of the people that may have voted for Bush ended up voting for Perot, and this made it easier for Clinton to win, right? So again, third parties don't really have much of a chance of winning elections, but their issues can be adopted by the big parties, and they themselves can play the role of election day spoiler and help determine the outcome of an election.